Welcome to Taking Stock on ENCA, the Taking Stock COVID-19 edition, going beyond COVID-19, as we've got three guests lined up for you this evening. Martin Kingston, who speaks on behalf of Business for South Africa. We've got Kieswetter, the SARS Commissioner, and we'll wrap it up this evening with Isaah Mhlanga. He is the Executive Chief Economist at Alexander Forbes. As South Africa moves from level 4 to level 3 restrictions, does the outlook for the economy begin to improve? We're in dire straits this evening, and we look to get some clarity on what the outlook is for South Africa going beyond COVID-19. On to Martin Kingston now. Martin speaks on behalf of Business for South Africa. It is an association of business leaders who are coming together to try and collaborate with government in the alleviation of huge pressure in the economy. Martin Kingston, welcome to Taking Stock. We've moved from level 4 to level 3. Some people say too little, too late.
Well, we had said, Bruce, that we needed to transition out of level 4 into level 3 and through level 3 to level 2. As quickly as possible. In fact, the level 3 regulations that have come out so far, we're very comfortable that we're actually beyond level 3 into level 2. Everything is included. There are some exceptions. I'm sure you'll want to talk about them. We would have liked to have seen it earlier, but we need to make sure that we're prepared as a country, particularly on the healthcare side, as we've said before. And companies also need to be prepared to have the requisite arrangements in place before they open up the workplace. As soon as we can do that, we need to certainly accelerate opening up the economy comprehensively, because we can see the impact that the lockdown has had on society at large, but specifically, of course, on the economy itself.
Let's talk about that in just a moment. I think we're one of the few countries in the world, if not the only one, to be opening up in an economy in a rising tide of COVID-19. Many other economies that are opening up appear to have peaked already. We're far away from that peak.
We did the right thing. We locked down ahead of the beginning of the surge. We don't know when that's going to come. Some people are now talking about as early as July. You'll remember before it was the end of August, the beginning of September. But what we know is that we're a long way away from the level of infection that we're going to experience as a country, and sadly the level of mortality that's going to ensue. And to do that, we had to prepare our health defences, and we've made, I think, enormous progress countrywide in doing that with PPE, with making sure our health workers are properly protected and trained, and indeed that the hospitals and indeed the field hospitals as well are put in place. Which is what we need ahead of the surge, because this is all about ensuring that our health system is not going to be overwhelmed when the infection levels ramp up. And we will have seen in other countries what happened as a consequence. So we think it was the right decision, one that we advocated with the president and government at the time. We'd like to come out of lockdown as quickly as possible, recognizing that we're going to, as you say, be coming out of lockdown at the very same time, that the infection rate will be rising and so will mortality.
It's a higher risk strategy, but the higher risk strategy, and I think this is the point you've always made, is to stay in lockdown in perpetuity, to hide ourselves from the grotesque economic reality which has evolved over the last 2 months, and that is a destruction of growth prospects, a destruction of jobs, some on a permanent basis, and a very fundamental potential restructuring of society as we know it.
Well, that's absolutely correct, Bruce. In fact, we need to recognize that the virus is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. We had a very good meeting with Professor Karim and some of his colleagues yesterday. Their assessment is that probably until the end of next year, we will be experiencing the virus. There's not just going to be one surge or one peak. It's going to come and go. And what we need to do as a society is we need to change our behavior. That's the only way in which we can suppress the transmission of the virus. And changing the behavior doesn't just happen in the workplace. It doesn't just happen in the transportation system, although that's clearly a very significant vector for transmission. It happens in our communities, wherever those communities may be, whether that's in Sandton or in Khayelitsha. Community transmission is the order of the day. That's what we're seeing happening in Cape Town. That's what we expect to happen in the Eastern Cape. And of course, hotspots that have been identified around the country, as the president said, indeed, over the weekend. And we're going to have to, as business, see what steps we can take to change behavior, not just, as I said, amongst our workforce, but much more broadly at society. and at the same time stimulate economic activity, because otherwise livelihoods are going to be sacrificed for absolutely no good reason at a time when we're trying to protect lives.
Behavior is all well and good to you and me. We're sitting in the relative comfort of our home. We have plenty of space around us. We may have a little bit of an outside area where we can stretch our legs. For the vast majority of South Africans, they live in far more compact conditions. People live very, very close together. Huge proximity issues in South Africa. Alexandra quoted to me the other day, it's one of the densest populated areas in Africa. I mean, under those sorts of circumstances, do we have a fighting chance against the vigorous spread of this virus?
Well, I believe we must prepare ourselves for the worst when we hear about the sort of projections that are being talked about in excess of 40,000 deaths associated with COVID-19 this year. I have no doubt that those models take those factors into consideration. Those are 40,000 deaths too many. But we look around the world and we see that the self-same manifestations are taking place elsewhere, and with no good explanation, by the way, as to why some countries are escaping the scourge of coronavirus and others are not. What we need to ensure is that we can provide the necessary social support structures, particularly for those people in townships, in informal settlements, where they don't have jobs, where they don't have the ability to access the basic requirements, where they're very vulnerable. And to do that, the economy needs to get back to work. We need to be able to ensure that we can maximize the collection of taxes. That's a major problem, as we saw from the statement that the Commissioner of SARS has already made. We need to ensure that we have maximum productivity. We need to change all of those aspects of the economy that perhaps were constraining activity in the past in very difficult circumstances. As you say, at a time when the level of infection is going to rise, we're going into our winter now, which is probably going to exacerbate conditions in any case. But that is no reason for turning the economic tap off. In fact, we need to turn it on as quickly and as aggressively as possible. At all times, I have to say, Bruce, ensuring that we act responsibly and carefully with respect to those behavior changes that need to be enforced to the extent that they can be.
Martin Kingston, thank you very much. You mentioned taxes. We've got Edward Kieswetter standing by. The SARS Commissioner will be talking to him on the show this evening. Martin Kingston speaking on behalf of Business for South Africa. Welcome back to Taking Stock here on ENCA. Edward Kieswetter is the SARS Commissioner. Now, Martin Kingston of Business for South Africa talking about the dramatic revenue shortfalls that the country is going to suffer this year. Edward Kieswetter, welcome to Taking Stock. Can you give us a position as up to date as possible on South Africa's current revenue position?
Thank you, Bruce. So we see that there's already a significant strain in specifically pay-as-you-earn as well as VAT. Now, you would know that pay-as-you-earn is a reflection of employment, and therefore we see a higher level of retrenchments, job losses, but also companies just struggling with cash flow. So there we're seeing, depending on where we are, around about 10% year-on-year decline already. And then in terms of VAT, which is a reflection of the consumption levels in the economy, we also see a significant decline there. The sectors that are really taking strain, quite understandably, would be wholesale and retail, as well as construction and manufacturing. Financial services, also not too healthy, being offset by one or two bonus payments that have kind of given a bit of a buffer, but that is soon going to disappear.
I mean, if you spend your time, as I do on a daily basis, going through company announcements on the Stock Exchange News Service, you get a very clear indication that companies that are reporting profits are reporting dramatically reduced profits. We've got companies that are going into loss-making territory, and some companies that are going and heading full tilt towards bankruptcy, in addition, of course, to those that have collapsed already. Do give me a sense, please, in terms of corporate tax rates, whether you're anticipating any revenue whatsoever.
Well, we're expecting a significant decline in revenue. I'll give you one anecdote, Bruce. A company last year, which in their March payment gave us over 800 million as a provisional payment, this year gave us nothing because they said that they will not record a profit, and therefore their estimate is zero. Now, even if they are slightly out by 10 or 20%, it's still from almost R1 billion to under 100 million rand. And so that's one example. We see many other examples. And then, of course, there will also be, and it's a concern that we have, is given the deferment, the debt deferment arrangements, we've already seen around about 10 billion rand of deferment in many of the taxes for debt deferments and compromises. And our fear is that many companies who in good faith apply for a deferment now with the hope that they will pay in a few months' time may not be around to pay. And so we're going from a huge contingent liability on the balance sheet of the state, of the fiscus. The initial estimation of all of the tax relief measures is 70 billion. We think it's going to be more, but more importantly, we think that some of that will eventually not be collectible because companies will struggle to come out of this period of sustained inactivity.
So what is your best estimate of just how big a revenue shortfall SARS is going to incur this year?
Well, we have modeled using just the range of economic growth, or let's say economic decline, that Treasury gave of between around about -5% to -15-16%. And we think that if in the best case scenario, we could be as low as 15% under recovery, which gets you to around about 240 billion. And at the higher end, we've penciled in about 285 billion rand shortfall. Now, where it will end will understandably depend on just how far we decline. And going into COVID, we were already down. And secondly, how slow we will recover, which is both a function of the phasing in of the economic activities, but also, and importantly, the number of casualties versus the number of survivors.
That's critical, and I'm sure that you are therefore supportive of a cautious, tentative, safe return to work, as South Africa does return to work on a gradual basis. It's not only necessary for our sanity, but it's necessary for our solvency as a country.
Absolutely, and so there are three variables that has to be balanced all the time. I mean, the big idea is that we have to learn to coexist with the virus. And so you have to manage, on the one hand, the health outcomes, and on the other hand, the economic outcomes, but importantly also social outcomes, because lockdown and disconnection, physical disconnection, have other unintended consequences for our psychosocial well-being. And it is probably the hardest time ever to be in government and to make these decisions, because government will be criticized whatever they decide, because there will be collateral damage in all of those spheres. And the best way is to find a point where you achieve the best possible outcome with whatever modeling you are using as a reference.
And so how then do you plan to navigate your way through this? I mean, National Treasury, of course, sets targets, and this was an almost 2 trillion rand budget this year. We're not going to get anywhere close to that. Borrowing is going to have to increase, and the pressure on you as an organization that was already under extreme duress when you took it over following the Moyane years at SARS, is it in a fit state to do the job that is required of it?
I think, first of all, we tend to always look at the glass half empty. I remind those who I speak to that even if we under-recover by 300 billion, SARS would still have collected about 1.1 billion rand. And that's an important positive in a sea and ocean of bad news. Secondly, we also know, if we are self-critical, that SARS at the moment is still suboptimal in its capability to collect. South Africa is still underperforming in terms of its compliance levels. And so we think that this year more than ever, our job would be not to wish that the economy improves. We take whatever the economy is, but our job will be to make sure that the compliance level increases. We can't afford to slip any further. My concern is the proliferation of the criminal and illicit economy. And so for us this year, a huge focus is improving the use of artificial intelligence, the use of data and technology to be able, on the one hand, to provide a seamless and effort-free service to taxpayers. We've done a lot of work. We've added more than 30 new applications to go almost completely online. That also supports the health measures and social distancing measures. But our use of technology also helps us detect areas of non-compliance. And more than ever before, whilst we are empathetic about the individual sufferings and casualties as a whole and in the interest of the greater good, we still have to ensure that we have the highest levels of compliance so that the revenue that is due is at least collected.
Edward Kieswetter, the SARS Commissioner, thank you very much. In a moment, we'll get the overview of the state of the economy and whether or not Edward Kieswetter is bang on the money with Isaah Mhlanga. He's chief economist at Alexander Forbes. That in a moment. Well, lots of doom and gloom scenarios around the post-COVID economy. And as we look beyond COVID, we do need to understand as best we possibly can what economic prospects are like. To help us through that, Isaah Mhlanga, who is the executive chief economist at Alexander Forbes. We've heard this evening from Business for South Africa. They're talking about a double-digit decline in growth. Edward Kieswetter is banking on perhaps -6, but as much as -15 or 16% contraction in this economy. What's your best estimate at this early stage of the year?
Bruce, I think, to be quite honest, it's very difficult to make forecasts in this current environment. We know from Statistics South Africa a number of publications have been delayed because itself has not been able to actually do the surveys that it normally does. So we have moved away from giving point forecasts to try and sketch scenarios to say, if this happens, if this lockdown continues for a little bit longer, what sort of numbers are we working with? So any number that is between 6 and 15 may be right. That's the fact of life.
The impact, the real world impact, we're beginning to see its effects come through in our economy. Company bankruptcies, job losses, wage expectations collapsing in a heap, inflation falling like we've never seen it fall in South Africa. I think in 2004, inflation was on average 1.4%. That's a record low. We could go into negative inflation environment in South Africa where prices actually start to contract as this economy gets smaller and smaller. Give me a realistic picture of what this economy looks like as the year progresses and as we work through this crisis.
We are going to be left with an economy that has an extremely high unemployment rate, 35 to 40 or even 45% if it progresses for much longer than that, which means we are going to see a significant number of company bankruptcies. Yes, we may have a 200 billion loan guarantee scheme, but that is it's not going to be nearly enough. And again, it helps with cash flow. It doesn't help companies to hire new employees. So it's not going to help much as far as that is concerned. We are going to have an economy with an extremely depressed consumer, which has huge ramifications for how the economy progresses post-COVID. Remember, when you have low consumer confidence, whatever savings consumers are going to get from the monetary policy moves in terms of cutting interest rate, they'll simply save because they're quite uncertain. Firstly, in terms of job prospects. Secondly, because they just feel unsafe as far as going out and spend that money is concerned, which means we are going to see some discretionary savings, at least for those that will still have jobs, which means we are going to get into a deflationary environment such that even the SARS forecast of a 3.4% inflation this year is a little bit on the high side. We're likely to enter into deflation. Yes, SSA has not been able to publish those numbers, but if you just look on the weekly surveys they've been doing, we already see signs of that, where the major basic categories or essential categories of goods and services have seen a deflationary environment. So that is the environment that we are going to end this COVID, whenever it ends. But again, we are also going to have an extremely high levels of debt, especially if you look in relation to GDP, because an extreme contraction in the economy and also a collapse in tax revenues would mean that the state would have to borrow its way to manage the economy. So that is one thing that we would have to deal with, because after all this is done, global investors are going to be quite selective in where they put their money. Countries that will be found with better economic fundamentals relative to other countries are going to benefit. Yes, all countries are going to deteriorate, that's a given, but relative to other countries, we are likely to be worse off, and as a result, we will find ourselves on the bad side of investors.
And that's a terribly gloomy outlook, but I think it's a realistic outlook. It's as if, every silver lining has a cloud. Is there a cloud that has a silver lining anywhere, or is we just in for the hard strokes for the next 2-3 years, probably?
I think as many commentators, economists, and even Treasury and the SARB have highlighted, this is an opportunity to reorient South Africa's economy into the productive sectors, which can actually generate economic growth. And it gives us an opportunity to actually say which are the sectors that are really quite critical for the economy. And we now know that we were quite extremely unprepared from a health point of view. We are also quite unprepared to shift production to be able to manufacture the essential medical goods that we require. What we would need to do is to create excess capacities in some few critical sectors. Electricity is one of them. We need to create an extremely excess capacity. And I hear today, load shedding is back in June, even with the economy operating at less than full capacity, which means whenever capacity retains to a full level, we're going to have extremely inadequacy in terms of electricity provision. So we need to create excess capacity in that particular sector. The healthcare sector, we also need to create excess capacity, because if we, Lord forbid, we are hit by another crisis from a healthcare point of view, we would need to be able to deal with it in the same manner that China was able to, because it had created all these excess capacities in the critical sectors that are, quite important for human life and human activity to continue to operate without much interruption.
So no silver linings then, unfortunately. Tough days ahead. The warning this evening from Isaah Mhlanga, who is the Executive Chief Economist at Alexander Forbes. Well, thanks to our guests for this evening. Isaah Mhlanga painting a very gloomy picture for the outlook for South Africa. Warnings from Edward Kieswetter that the cash revenue shortfalls for government are going to be significant. And Martin Kingston, also from Business for South Africa, really concerned that we're not going to get this economy knocked back into shape anytime soon. From me to you, have a very good evening. Thank you very much for watching. Good night.